Welcome to Naptown People's Radio. This is your producer, Dakota Fronterhouse. Black August ended yesterday, and we bring you this special episode to ensure we enter September conscious of the additional knowledge, increased commitment, and fortified dedication to continue fighting for the liberation of our comrades behind bars and all working and oppressed people worldwide. On August 27th, PSL Indianapolis held its annual Black August Liberation Forum at the Indianapolis Liberation Center. At the event, Derek Ford, our co-host here of Naptown People's Radio, delivered a speech placing George Jackson and its Black New African liberation struggle in its historical and material context. In the talk, Derek explains the many reasons why George Jackson continues inspiring new generations of organizers and activists. They also explain some of the struggles within the movement at the time, including an intra-party struggle between Black Panther Party leaders that erupted around Jonathan Jackson's heroic attempt to free the Soledad brothers. Explaining George's theory of the revolutionary potential of prisoners and the quote-unquote ebb and flow of the movement, he ends with a reminder that any organization that doesn't center our comrades behind walls is not worth a grain of salt, and that we still have people like Shaka Shakur who continue turning prisons into schools of revolutionaries. And without further ado, here's Derek Ford.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. Before I begin, I did want to note that today is the 62nd anniversary of the death of the great W.E.B. Du Bois. He died at the age of 95 while living in Ghana. Du Bois was a revolutionary, a Pan-Africanist, a communist inspired by his many trips to the Soviet Union, where for the first time he encountered a society free of racism, national chauvinism, and oppression. It was no utopia, but it was the kind of society that we are fighting for, the kind of society that we want to turn to George Jackson to help us create. So George Jackson is a household name across the revolutionary left, and rightly so. But don't feel bad if you're not familiar with him. I think, the brief biography we got at the beginning is sufficient in many ways. There's good reason for us to speak about George Jackson at our Black August Liberation Forum, of course. The tradition was first celebrated in San Quentin Prison in 1979 in commemoration of George's assassination there by prison guards on August 21st, 1971. And even when he was alive, he served as a symbol of the Black struggle and the fight against racist incarceration because of his relentless commitment to self-determination and to self-defense and to autonomy and independence. In fact, in October of 1970, George's first book, Soledad Brother, was released to wide acclaim. Maybe the editor-in-chief was out of the office that week, but the New York Times ran a review that ended with this paragraph, and I quote, "Some will think these letters represent the feelings of one Black man who has been in jail too long, but all Blacks are in jail. George Jackson's pure, unadulterated rage is merely the result of his closer confinement. This is the most important single volume from a Black since the autobiography of Malcolm X. And its impact among Blacks may be even greater, particularly in light of the recent and growing number of rebellions inside prisons." The book's release party was widely attended, and the book's editor flew out from New York City to Marin County to San Quentin Prison, where the party was held outside of prison gates, so of course the author could not attend. And so we compare that with their 1949 article about Paul Robeson. And so if you don't know, right, this is a man who went to Rutgers on a scholarship. He was the only Black student there. While he was there, he was an All-American football player in both his junior and senior years. He earned 12 varsity letters in baseball, track, and basketball. He was class valedictorian, graduating in 1919. He earned his law degree from Columbia Law School in 1923, and during that time, he played in the NFL for 3 different teams. That's how he paid for law school. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame finally in 1995. Not only that, he was a Broadway actor, starring in 10 major plays, many of them award-winning. He played the first Black Othello. His talents were known worldwide. He was an acclaimed singer. He even sang in Chinese and English after working with Chinese revolutionary Liu Liangmo to translate Chinese patriotic songs into English, recording a record named Chi Lai, or March of the Volunteers. And, not to mention his activism and other professional activities, including, they attempted to try and recruit him to play professional baseball. And yet in 1949, this same paper ran a headline calling him a Black Stalin with delusions of grandeur. I mean, basically every single thing he did, he excelled at. He was humble as well and a supporter of the Soviet Union, socialist states, and all national liberation struggles. He also deeply impacted Malcolm X. This man, was no Black Stalin. He had no delusions of grandeur. He was amazing. So in 1971, the same paper presents George Jackson as a hero, as did, much of the bourgeois press. So what accounts for the difference? I mean, there's no doubt that the masses are drawn to George's intellect, his organizing capacity, and his absolute, resolute insistence in practice and in theory that the state, however it presents itself, is destructible. He challenged and fought racist guards. He built organizations in unity, and he quickly became a widely known figure. But as Ceci mentioned earlier, history is not made by quote unquote great men, and George didn't believe that. In one letter, he writes, quote, "The successes of China, Cuba, Vietnam, and parts of Africa cannot be attributed to any innate, singular quality in the characteristics of their people. We are social creatures, herd animals. We follow leaders. The successes or failure of mass movements depend on their leadership and the method of their leaders." End quote. So again, how is it that this book was reviewed in the New York Times and serialized in the New York Review of Books? What was the historical context that allowed the book to get published in the first place? Exploring these questions helps us get beneath the symbol of Jackson, as, if one could understand him and his actions and his organizations, his intellect, without accounting for the material conditions at the time. He was born into a ghetto on the west side of Chicago in 1941 to a postal worker and a homemaker. They could trace the roots back to the South, of course, and his parents were largely apolitical. But his daily life politicized him, although unconsciously. So when George, like many teenagers, started acting out, the family moved to Los Angeles to, pursue a new environment. However, of course, racism followed the family there. I mean, obviously it was already there. So, that didn't work. And he was arrested, I think, 3 times in 1957 for attempted petty burglary, which is, really nothing. But then on September 18th of 1960, 5 days before he was his 19th birthday, he was in a car. They were driving back he was driving back with friends from Tijuana, and they stopped at a gas station where his friend, stole $70, and they were arrested. His public defender convinced him to take a plea. The judge sentenced him to between 1 year and life in prison. What they called at the time an indeterminate sentence. And this was a phrase used for, in California, which was the pinnacle of the liberal prison. The idea being that, you could be released as soon as you were rehabilitated by, a parole board that included doctors and psychologists and so on. But what improvement meant was your ability to adapt to capitalist white supremacy. And the setting for this rehabilitation was a deeply racist and brutal prison system, one that was even more racist and polarized along national lines than the neighborhoods that George grew up in. Between 1962 and 1970, it was reported that George was written up 47 times for disciplinary issues. He was denied parole 10 times. He was in prison even after his friend, who actually committed the robbery, was released. The reason he wasn't rehabilitated was because he was playing poker. He wasn't cleaning his cells. He had too many cigarettes on him. At least these were the official reasons. But the prisons he was in, San Quentin and Soledad, were the most segregated prisons in the era. They had all-white CEOs who beat black prisoners or let white inmates do their beating for them. In 1963, the Bluebirds, a neo-Nazi group, they were a major force inside of prisons. And George fought back, in self-defense, and he wasn't alone. Prison uprisings, rebellions, and quote-unquote disturbances, they were increasing yearly. George was assassinated in the middle of a wave of prison uprisings. Over 15 reported in 1968 and more than 48 in 1972. But more important than the number of uprisings was the political character of the uprisings, because people always resist. But how do they resist? So one of the major political forces, black forces, to emerge in the prison system was the Nation of Islam. It grew rapidly in the 1950s. I didn't know much about the 1940s, as Haki addressed earlier. And George's eventual comrade, Eldridge Cleaver, was radicalized by the NOI in 1958 when he was in prison. And Cleaver left the NOI in 1963, just a year before Malcolm X did. Malcolm X, of course, was deeply influenced by Paul Robeson. The NOI's influence in prisons waned, really rapidly. Among the many reasons was the absence of critical action against an analysis of the systemic forces. They were, said to talk tough, do little, and their disparaging attitude toward criminality. They saw it as a defect of the individual, and what differentiated George's theory so sharply and what made it so attractive to the masses was his assessment that quote-unquote criminals and those in prison aren't there because of individual failings and that they had immense revolutionary potential. So we mostly associate George with the Black Panther Party, which is correct but partial. George joined the Black Panther Party in 1969. Starting the year before, he, according to his fellow inmates, started reading their paper regularly because Huey P. Newton was arrested in 1968, and that made waves throughout the prison movement. But George didn't start writing for the paper until the last year of his life. His first article, titled A Tribute to Three Slain Brothers, appeared in the January 16th, 1971 edition of the Black Panther Party paper. And so, for those who don't know, the party was started in the fall of 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. They were both students at a community college who were organizing in the Black community. And they founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense, used a symbol of a political party that was a political wing of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was operating under the direction of Stokely Carmichael. And 1966 was a pivotal year for the Black struggle in many ways. So first, Carmichael, likely convinced by activist Willie Ricks, spoke the words Black Power on a June 16th, 1966 Greenwood, Mississippi rally. It was part of the March Against Fear. Carmichael actually initially opposed it. It was like a one-man march, peaceful march, but then the leader was attacked violently. They participated in it then. So Carmichael was arrested for trespassing, and he was released a few hours later. He took to the podium, in front of 1,500 activists and, uttered these words, Black Power, with no idea how they would really galvanize the movement, and traverse space, time, and political currents. And it wasn't the first time, these words were uttered together, right? Like Richard Wright wrote a book called Black Power, I think, over a decade before. But it was this enunciation that became a rallying cry, right? That became a central feature and site of contestation in the struggle. Black Power dominated as a demand and organizing slogan during the ascendancy of the iteration of the Black liberation struggle in this period of time. And it wasn't due to Carmichael's politics, but to the fact that, it was such an open slogan, right? I mean, and Carmichael himself didn't really clear it up. And as you open up the waters, they get muddied. And so there becomes a need for ideological clarification, which started to happen the same year, even earlier. In January of 1966, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, adopted a resolution opposing the U.S. war in Vietnam. So it was the first civil rights organization to do so. The NAACP, by the way, supported the war for the entire time. And CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, tabled the resolution in 1965 at its convention. And SNCC did more than oppose the war. They actually said, we support those who refuse to go to war. The politics of all three groups really corresponded to the composition of their membership. this is in Black Awakening in Capitalist America. The author discusses this, right, where, the NAACP represented the wealthiest segment of the Black population, and both CORE and SNCC were multinational and, more middle class. CORE's membership was, so CORE's membership, was, predominantly middle class. Its tactics were more militant, but it wasn't really ideologically questioning the basis of U.S. society. But the rank and file organizers with SNCC, as the author notes, were, quote, younger, not yet committed to middle-class jobs or middle-class lifestyles, end quote. And so it was more likely for them to identify with the lumpen proletariat, or the dangerous classes, those who George was, saw revolutionary potential in. And it's also the next year, right, SNCC was the only, one of a few groups to oppose Israel's Six-Day War. And so many joined the ranks of the Panthers, who had a thoroughly internationalist and anti-imperialist analysis and perspective. Jackson, of course, at the time was far advanced in his thinking as an anti-imperialist. So it's not surprising he ended up becoming a member and a martyr of the Panthers. But as I said, that's just part of it. He actually spent more time as a member of an organization that he started, along with W.L. Nolan, who Aki was talking about, and another inmate at San Quentin Prison, called the Black Guerrilla Family. They took the NOI's emphasis on self-help, and combined it with a Marxist analysis and an emphasis on revolutionary processes that were taking place across the globe. And even earlier, by 1962, I think, prison authorities identified George as a leader of the Black resistance in prison. So they started it in 1966, and they said that it was a, quote, African-American Marxist-Leninist party, end quote. And it did quickly become the largest political prison organization. They were teaching prisoners Marx, Mao Zedong, Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, Julius Nyerere, Frantz Fanon. Inspired by the revolutionary wave sweeping the world and the need to understand the world in order to change it, the classes were instrumental in bringing out the revolutionary potential of those behind bars. In the fall of 1969, after he and his comrades were transferred to Soledad Prison, George started setting up an underground chapter of the Black Panther Party, and Huey P. Newton gave him the honorary title of Chief Marshal or Field Marshal. During George's tenure in the Black Panther Party, though, he ended up being placed in the middle of a sort of intra-party battle. So, first I should say that the Black Panther Party never really cohered for many reasons, from geography to repression and infiltration. Between 1966 and 75 alone, the Chicago field office, FBI field office, had more than 5,000 snitches and agent provocateurs working amongst the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and other revolutionary groups. There were so many that they were actually snitching on each other. And there were also, ideological and tactical struggles taking place. So after Huey was arrested, the party focused more on community programs, right? And without abandoning its revolutionary goals. Much to the dismay of Eldridge Cleaver. So 55 years ago this month, earlier, I think August 7th, Jonathan Jackson, George's brother, entered the Marion County Courthouse where three prisoners, William Christmas, Rochelle McGee, who were defense witnesses for their fellow prisoner, James McLean, who was accused of assaulting a guard, were present. And so Jackson goes in there, he pulls out a shotgun and said he was taking over, and he took over. And so he took the three inmates with him, and he also took the judge into a van, to demand the release of the three prisoners as well as George. And it didn't last long. Jonathan became a martyr, right? And the judge was killed, but not by Jonathan, but actually by a cop. McGee is the only one who survived. He actually remained incarcerated until 2023, and unfortunately, as often happens, died 81 days later. And Jonathan's gun was registered to Angela Davis. And one informant said that the LA chapter of the party helped organize the escape attempt. They were allegedly planning on joining Cleaver, who at the time was in exile in Cuba. But when the party's central committee became aware of the plans, they warned against it. And then 2 days before it happened, Huey P. Newton walked out of prison and, withdrew his support. Now, so there's, a lot of debate about this. Some say that nobody told Jonathan and he thought he had all the support. One snitch even said that George, personally knew that, Huey withdrew his support for the action. But, even let's say that's true, right? George actually stuck with Huey P. Newton over the, as the battle played out. He never said exactly why, at least in my knowledge, but it's likely, he could discern the opportunism of Cleaver, right? He talked tough from exile, and also he later became a born-again Christian, a Mormon, a far-right Republican, really whatever suited the moment. So George's intellect stands strong today, whether it be his polemics with Angela Davis over his characterization of the U.S. as fascist, or his gentle letters to his father explaining how China was helping to liberate Africa. And while few have taken him seriously as a thinker and a theorist, we should carry at least two aspects of his theory with us. He was radicalized after his incarceration, which to some extent has to account for the primacy of the role of prisons he gave to his strategic analysis. For George, and for us, right, prisons are schools of revolution. They could rapidly graduate revolutionary cadre by transforming their thinking and their practice. He believed in the quote-unquote lumpen proletariat. And so this is a bit of an aside, but, and I don't know the German word for this, but when Marx wrote Capital and other texts, it's often translated as lumpen proletariat. And in the New Left Review edition of Capital, that's how it's translated. And but the New Left Review is headed by, really anti-communist academics. Now, the original official translation published by the Marx, Engels Institute in the Soviet Union by international publishers, which I recommend, translated it into the dangerous classes, right? Marx believed in their dangerousness and their revolutionary potential. So he was actually more in line with Jackson on this. And, both believed they were potentially revolutionary. The other key aspect is that any movement that doesn't include our comrades behind bars isn't worth salt. The politicization of prisons today is at a massive lull compared to the 1970s, compared to the 80s, compared to the 90s, due to many factors, the influx of heavy narcotics and benzodiazepines brought in by prison guards, other tactics of counterinsurgency behind the prison walls. But let me read these words from George, which were printed in a 1971 interview in a Cuban paper. He said, "Right now we are in a peak cycle. There's tremendous energy out there directed against the state. It's not all focused, but it's there and it's building. We'll see. And we can certainly hope that this is a case, but perhaps not. We must be prepared to wage a long struggle. If this is the case, then we'll probably see a different cycle, one in which the revolutionary energy of the people seems to have dispersed, run out of steam. But, and this is important, such cycles are deceptive. Things appear to be at a low ebb, but actually what's happening is a period of regroupment, a period in which we step back and learn from the mistakes made during the preceding cycle. We educate ourselves from our experience, and we educate those around us. And all the while, we develop and perfect our core organization. Then the next time a peak cycle comes around, we're far readier than we were the last time. So there's still immense revolutionary potential in our comrades and fellow workers outside and behind prison bars. We still have leaders like Shaka Shakur, who, as Seth Donnelly recently said, turns every prison he enters into a school of revolution. And we at the Indianapolis Liberation Center are honored to work with him, and we can't tell you how much he has helped build this center and the movement, not just for prisoners, but for all oppressed people right here in this city. And he's done so from domestic exile in Virginia, from behind prison bars. I can't emphasize that enough. But Shaka can't do it on his own, and neither can we. But we are and we must do everything we can to generate the subjective forces necessary for a real movement and a real revolution, for that regroupment that George insisted upon. Because we will win. That's why we're revolutionaries. Why join a revolutionary organization if we don't believe we can win? So let's keep building, supporting our comrades behind bars, free all political prisoners, dare to struggle, dare to win. Thank you.
You can watch other speeches, including that of our keynote speaker, Haki Kweli Shakur, by clicking on the show notes below. I want to thank you for dropping in to listen to this special episode of Naptown People's Radio. Please stay tuned for our next episode to drop here in just a few days. And always remember this, we're in this together. So go out there and keep working together, fighting together, learning together, organizing together, and free all political prisoners, prisoners of war. This is your producer, Dakota Fronterhouse, signing out.